Hey guys, tonight we wander into a place where the smell of linseed oil and rabbit glue hangs thicker than the night air. You find yourself stepping softly into a Renaissance painter's workshop, somewhere between Florence and Venice, maybe in the sleepy hours after the apprentices have gone home. The lantern light flickers against the plaster walls, glancing off metal pots, brushes and folded cloths. It's warm, earthy, and so still you can hear the faint ticking of cooling wood. You probably won't survive this. Not because of danger, but because we're about to talk about something so gently uneventful that your eyelids will surrender before we even reach the second canvas frame. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where this sleepy little community tunes in from. Now, dim the lights, let quiet settle in, and ease yourself into the calm rhythm of tonight's story. The wooden floor creaks as you walk deeper into the painter's world. The day's labour lingers everywhere, the faint hue of ochre dust, a streak of blue on a table edge, a forgotten rag that has stiffened with oil. The master painter has gone home, leaving the faint outline of his presence in half-washed brushes and a pot of pigment cooling beside the fire. You can imagine yourself as one of those nameless apprentices, not the genius who signs the paintings, but the one who sweeps the corners, boils the glue, and tries not to sneeze when grinding malachite. Your hands are rough with lye soap and flecks of dried colour, the kind that never fully comes out no matter how much you scrub. The year might be 1510, Venice hums with trade, Florence still buzzes with ambition. Everywhere, painters are learning to work faster, larger and cheaper than ever before. The secret: canvas. Before this time, panels ruled, sturdy oak boards coated in chalk and glue. But panels are heavy, prone to warping, and small enough to make an ambitious artist sigh. Canvas changed everything. Cheaper, lighter, and perfect for rolling up when a duke changed palaces. Yet no one in these studios would dare think of it as easy. Stretching and preparing canvas was an art form of its own. The apprentice version of you moves through this space as the firelight dips, noticing every surface. On one table you see pestles and mortars, on another a stack of primed cloths ready for painting. In the far corner jars of oil and resin sit half-closed, the air around them shimmering slightly with the smell of drying paint. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, dust. Fine dust from chalk and pumice, heavier dust from linen fibres, and that invisible kind that sticks in the back of your throat and makes the air feel centuries old. You light another candle, its wick hissing softly, and take a moment to think about what it means to work here. No mass-produced brushes, no pre-stretched canvases, no convenient tubes of paint. If you want to paint, you must first make the very world on which the painting will live, its craftsmanship as meditation. You begin by preparing the studio. The benches must be wiped free of the powder from yesterday's grinding, the mortar rinsed with spirits, the brushes standing bristles up in a jar checked for stray hairs. Painters were not just artists, they were chemists, carpenters, and patient alchemists of the visual world. There's a saying that might have floated around then, passed from master to apprentice. A good painting begins in the silence before colour. It means that everything, the texture, the light, the depth, depends on what happens long before a brush ever touches pigment. Historians still argue whether early Renaissance painters actually enjoyed this labour or saw it as drudgery. Some accounts describe masters like Bellini and Veronese personally testing each batch of glue, sniffing it as it simmered to make sure it hadn't spoiled. Others suggest they left such humble chores to apprentices, saving their inspiration for sketchbooks and wealthy patrons. But the truth is probably somewhere in between. Your eyes trace the tools on the nearest bench. You see knives, their blades dulled from scraping gesso, awls and needles for pricking transfer drawings, even a seashell or two used to hold small portions of paint. A soft joke of the workshop was that the seashells worked better than the apprentices. They didn't talk back, didn't spill pigment, and didn't need feeding. You stir a small pot of glue warming over coals. It's made from rabbit skin, which sounds absurdly specific, but that collagen-based gelatin was perfect for sealing canvas. Its scent is faintly sweet, faintly like wet hay. It's one of those smells that, once learned, never leaves your memory. You think about how odd it must have been to live surrounded by colour yet see so little of it outside the studio. Streets were dusty, clothing muted, architecture sun-bleached. In contrast, these workshops exploded with ultramarine cinnabar and emerald hues, the visual dreams of a drab reality. A soft laugh escapes you, remembering that some painters, desperate for new shades, experimented with bizarre materials, crushed beetles, charred peach stones, even powdered mummy remains. Yes, actual mummies. Historians still debate whether that was apocryphal, you murmur, brushing dust from your sleeve, but you decide not to linger too long on that image before bed. As the night deepens, you sit by the window, the narrow street below empty except for a cat slinking across the stones. The moonlight touches the stretched canvases like pale sails waiting for wind. You realise that each one represents both potential and peril. One wrong ratio of oil to pigment, one damp afternoon, and the surface could buckle, crack, or darken. Yet the painters did it anyway, every day, because they loved that moment when dull linen became luminous with form. You pick up a scrap of fabric, rough and cool, and hold it up to the light. It's plain now, but in a few days it could hold angels, merchants, or mythic gods. It could hang in a chapel or above a city hall. It could even be rolled up, shipped across the Adriatic, and stretched again in a noble's hall somewhere far away. There's something deeply peaceful in realising that art, even the grandest of it, begins with such ordinary gestures: boiling, sanding, brushing, and waiting. You can feel your breath slowing to match the rhythm of this invisible work. The soft scrape of a knife on wood, the trickle of warm glue, the faint hum of the night outside. Before long you catch yourself blinking slowly, lulled by the sameness of the studio sounds. The Renaissance has stopped being a chapter in a textbook and become a dimly lit room full of sighs, patience, and quiet obsession. The lantern burns lower. You stretch your hands, feeling the stickiness of glue between your fingers, and let your thoughts drift. Soon, you'll start working on that first real surface, the canvas itself, and the steps that make it ready for centuries of colour. For now, though, the night hums gently, and you rest in the small, patient heartbeat of a painter's world, where everything begins with stillness. The first light of morning slips through the shutters, thin and grey, the sort that barely stirs the dust. You've been here all night, sitting among drying glue pots and the quiet smell of wood smoke, and now the day finds you hunched beside a heap of cloth. The fabric looks ordinary enough, wrinkled, unbleached, smelling faintly of hemp and sea. But this is where painting leaves behind its wooden past and becomes lighter, freer. You pick up a piece and run your hand across it. It's rough at first, a texture that catches on your fingertips. Wooden panels, those smooth, solid slabs of poplar or oak that artists used before, never felt like this. They were heavy, hard, and utterly unyielding. The transition from those solid panels to this pliant woven skin changed not only how paintings looked, but how painters thought. You can imagine the old masters, Giotto, Fra Angelico, labouring over polished boards, their saints standing still beneath gold leaf. But now, around the turn of the 15th century, artists in Venice were looking for something lighter, something that could breathe in the city's damp air. Wood in Venice swelled and warped, and the salty humidity turned even the best panel into a carpenter's nightmare. Linen canvas, however, survived the moisture. It stretched, it shifted, it forgave. Historians still argue whether Venice's weather truly drove the innovation, or whether it was the painter's restlessness. Maybe both. Maybe it was simple economics. Wood had to be imported. Linen could be bought by the yard. A pragmatic miracle, born from trade routes and weather forecasts centuries before meteorology. You sit at a carpenter's bench where strips of fir are stacked neatly. Fir, pine, sometimes poplar, whatever could be cut and joined into rectangular frames. The wooden skeleton of the canvas. You can smell the resin as you run a hand along the edge, sticky where it was freshly sawn. These frames weren't decorative yet, just functional, the quiet architecture behind every painting. You take one and lay it on the floor. The master insists that everything begins square, every corner true, or else the canvas will sag and the image will warp. He says it the way a priest might say a prayer, without question, without variation. As you fit the bars together, the scene outside grows louder. Bells ring in the distance, calling people to church or trade. You imagine Venice waking, its canals glinting in the pale morning. Inside this small studio, though, time feels slower. You line up the joints and tap them together gently with a wooden mallet. There's a myth, half romantic, half ridiculous, that artists of the time stretched canvases by hand and eye alone. No measuring tools, no squares. That can't possibly be true. Even now, you use a measuring cord rubbed with charcoal to mark precise lengths. Renaissance painters were dreamers, yes, but also engineers. Every great work began with geometry. As you work, you remember something you heard from another apprentice. They used to paint on sailcloth, you know. It sounds apocryphal, but not entirely false. Venetian traders brought strong hemp and linen used for ship sails, and some thrifty painters bought scraps to practice. Those heavy fabrics were coarse, rough, and full of spirit. Imagine the irony. Portraits of nobles and Madonnas born on the same cloth that once braved Adriatic storms. You stretch the fabric across the frame now, pulling each edge tight until the weave begins to hum with tension. The first sound of creation, not the stroke of a brush, but the soft creak of cloth pulled taut. You pin it with tacks, no staples, no mechanical ease, just hammer and instinct. The rhythm is steady. Tap, stretch, breathe. In this moment you feel oddly calm. You're not thinking of glory or commissions, just of balance. The way the fibres align, the way the corners behave. Painters back then might not have called it mindfulness, but the act itself was its own kind of quiet meditation. Some workshops used temporary strainers, fixed wooden frames that couldn't expand. Others later on used stretchers with wedges you could tap to retighten the fabric as it aged. Historians still debate whether those stretchers were common before the 17th century. Probably not. For now, you work the old way, fixed tension, one chance to get it right. A gull cries outside, faint and distant as you smooth the final fold. The canvas looks plain, like a piece of laundry drying in the breeze. Yet it's something more, its potential in physical form. You step back, eye it critically. The weave is even. The light glances across without puckering. You can't help smiling a little, proud of something so simple. Then comes the more tedious part, trimming. You cut away excess fabric, careful not to nick the stretched surface. The edges curl slightly, and you press them down, hammering the last nails into place. The sound echoes softly through the workshop. While the glue pot reheats behind you, you look around and notice older panels stacked against a wall. They're heavy, dark with age. You can see how they bowed slightly, cracked where the gesso layer gave way. Those panels are relics of an older age of painting. Sacred, yes, but inflexible. Canvas allows you to dream bigger. Frescoes may crumble on church walls, but a painted canvas can be rolled, carried, sold, and hung anew. One of the master's older apprentices once joked, "Panels belong to the church, canvas belongs to anyone with a wall." He wasn't wrong. Art was leaving the chapel and stepping into homes, palaces, and markets. The Renaissance, for all its divine faces, was becoming human again. You sit beside your finished frame and let your fingers rest against the tight cloth. It vibrates faintly when you tap it, a drum waiting for a song. You think about how strange it is that something this mundane could outlive cathedrals. Painting survives centuries because someone, maybe someone like you, once took the time to stretch linen just right. The day warms, the smell of the city drifting in, the canal, the fish market, the faint sweetness of resin and oil. You imagine Titian, Bellini, or even a young Tintoretto doing the same mundane task somewhere nearby, sweating under the same morning light. You smile because for all the talk of genius, this was the truth of their craft. Endless, repetitive, beautifully dull labour. You can almost hear the master teasing, "Art begins when your fingers ache." Outside, a bell tolls again, and the sound vibrates faintly through the stretched linen. It feels alive under your palm, waiting. The panels may be gone, the glue not yet dry, but this surface, is where imagination will soon breathe colour. You don't know it yet, but this shift from rigid wood to flexible cloth will redefine centuries of painting. It's the beginning of portability, of scale, of experimentation. You glance once more at the glowing square, thinking of how countless masterpieces began exactly like this, with a frame, some cloth, and a quiet morning. And then, as if on cue, the studio cat leaps onto the table, curling into the soft warmth of unused linen. You sigh, amused. Some things never change. You stand in the half-light of the studio again, And today, your hands reach for fabric. Real fabric. Not yet taut, not yet primed, just raw and whispering of its journey from field to loom. It smells faintly of flax, dust, and salt. The merchant who brought it swore it was the best in Venice, spun from Belgian flax and woven tight enough to hold both saints and scandal. You're not entirely sure if he was lying, but his confidence was so thick you almost paid extra just to escape the conversation. Choosing linen or hemp isn't glamorous. It's not about artistry or divine inspiration. It's about thread count. You unroll the bolt and let it puddle over the work table. The weave catches the light, tiny grids of fibre crossing like disciplined soldiers. You run your fingers along it and can almost hear the loom's rhythm still echoing from the weaver's workshop. Clack, pull, release. Linen was prized, of course. The northern European fields made fibres so fine they could hold the most delicate glazes without swallowing the colour. Hemp, on the other hand, was cheaper, tougher, and coarser, ideal for large works destined for public halls or for painters still paying off last month's pigment bill. Historians still argue whether masters like Tintoretto truly used hemp for great works or reserved it for underpaintings. Some claim he favoured it for his immense ceilings. Its strength meant fewer tears, even if it did chew up brushes faster. You cut a length from the bolt, feeling the soft resistance of the fabric. The shears squeak, a sound oddly satisfying, like cutting through time. You imagine the fields where this flax once stood, swaying in a northern breeze, never dreaming it would one day support a portrait of a duke or a Madonna. The master once told you, good linen is like good marble. You start smooth, and you'll end divine. He was half right. Linen gives you smoothness, yes, but it also gives you something subtler, flexibility. It bends, breathes, and moves with the seasons. In damp winters, it sags slightly. In dry summers, it tightens. The painter learns to anticipate it like a musician tuning strings. You hold the fabric up to the window. Morning light spills through the weave, revealing its tiny imperfections, knots, uneven strands, the occasional dark fleck from the retting process when the stalks were left to rot in water to free the fibres. Every piece of cloth carries those traces of labour. You think of the anonymous workers, farmers, spinners, weavers, each leaving invisible fingerprints on the canvas before a single stroke of paint. And yes, before you even ask, some painters were absolute snobs about their fabric. In Florence, certain workshops rejected anything with a visible knot. Venetian ones were more forgiving. The humid air and looser brushwork disguised minor flaws. A Florentine painter would have called that laziness. A Venetian would have called it style. You smooth the cloth over the bench, measuring, aligning the warp threads with the frame's edge. You mutter under your breath, something between a prayer and a complaint, as you check for uniform tension. There's a trick you've learned. Tug one corner and listen. A well-woven linen hums softly, a whispering thrum like a distant cello. Too slack and it sighs, too tight and it cracks. While you work, you overhear other apprentices arguing over thread counts. The tighter the better, one insists. Another counters, no, the paint needs somewhere to sink or it slides right off. You half smile, they could debate all day, and still the truth would hide in between. Historians still debate whether Renaissance painters consciously matched their fabric to the kind of painting they planned. Did Titian choose finer weaves for portraits and coarser ones for mythological scenes? Some evidence says yes. Infrared scans of his works show different weaves beneath different subjects, but maybe, just maybe, he simply grabbed what was available that week. Supply chains, even in the Renaissance, were chaotic. The merchant returns later that morning with more cloth. He waves a scrap of canvas in the air and swears it came from the same batch Leonardo once used, though you suspect he says that every week. Touch it, he urges. Feel how it sings. You oblige, pretending to hear music. The merchant beams, convinced you're a man of exquisite taste. You pay too much, of course. Everyone does. You haul the rolls back to the studio and lean them against the wall beside the wooden frames. They look so plain, like laundry waiting for a wash. But when you look closer, you notice how light and shadow ripple across their surfaces like waves over sand. Already you can see landscapes, folds of cloth, soft skin waiting to be born under brush and glaze. There's a rhythm to all this. The measuring, cutting, stretching. You think of it as a quiet rehearsal before the performance of painting begins. In the stillness, you hear your own breathing. steady, calm. Every little sound becomes sharper. The scuff of fabric against wood, the creak of your stool, the muffled chatter from a nearby courtyard. You wipe your hands on a rag and take a moment to rest. Your palms are warm, faintly sticky from glue and oil. You think of how many painters have done exactly this, hundreds of years apart, but with the same gestures, the same patience. There's a story the older apprentices whisper, probably invented but charming nonetheless. They say one careless painter once used leftover ship sail for a canvas, complete with patches and tar stains. When his patron saw the uneven surface, he threatened to dock his payment. But the painter, quick-witted, claimed it was intentional, that the roughness gave divine texture. The patron believed him, and now every time an apprentice botches a stretch, someone calls it divine texture and laughs until the master yells. You glance around the studio, smiling at the memory of that story. There's always laughter mixed with labour here. It keeps the glue from cooling too fast, or so they say. By midday, the new canvases are stacked neatly, waiting for sizing. The light from the windows hits their edges, turning them pale gold. They look fragile, but hold centuries of tradition in their threads. You rest your hand on the topmost one, feeling its faint warmth. It's strange how fabric, simple, woven plant fibre, can become a vessel for immortality. Somewhere in another part of the city, bells ring again. The gulls scream, the canals glint, and the smell of cooking oil drifts in. You close your eyes and imagine this same moment repeating across hundreds of studios, men and women bent over bolts of fabric, making the dullest, most necessary kind of magic. Soon, you'll heat the glue again and begin sealing the weave. But for now, you just stand there, quiet and content, as the light slides gently across your chosen cloth, the same way it once slid across every masterpiece before the colour ever touched it. The workshop smells of fresh wood and sea air again, though perhaps that's wishful thinking. It's more likely resin, sweat, and the faint sourness of boiled glue. You've been cutting frames since dawn, working the saw with deliberate rhythm, because nothing ruins a painting faster than a crooked rectangle. The master once said that a painting's soul rests in its bones, meaning the frame, not the saintly subject. He wasn't being poetic, he meant it literally. You run your hand over the length of pine before you, smooth where the plane has done its job. Each bar must be perfectly square, the corners crisp, the joints firm. No one ever sees this skeleton once the canvas is stretched, yet every future brushstroke depends on its strength. A warped frame can make even the Virgin Mary look seasick. You measure twice, then again, because these timbers have minds of their own. They shrink with humidity, swell with heat, and twist if you turn your back too long. Some painters used oak or fir, others preferred softer woods for easier cutting. Fir, especially from the north, carried just enough resin to resist decay, but not so much it bled through the paint. You can still feel a faint tackiness beneath your fingertips, resin that smells like the ghosts of Christmas trees. Now comes the joining. You cut shallow miters at each end, fit them together like puzzle pieces, and secure them with small wooden pegs. It's slow, deliberate work. No nails yet. Nails rust. The whole point is to keep the structure flexible enough that the fabric can shift without splitting. Historians still argue whether keyed stretchers, the ones with little wedges you could tap to retighten the canvas, were used during the Renaissance or appeared later in the Baroque. The consensus leans toward later, but in your workshop, the master swears by tension blocks, small wooden inserts tapped into the corners. They give the painting breath, he insists, though sometimes they give you nothing but splinters. You line the finished frame on the table and stand back. It's plain, unadorned, and looks suspiciously like furniture. There's beauty in that utility, though, the kind of beauty you don't notice until it fails. You set a square against one corner, check the angle, and feel relief when the blade fits snug. No error, no tilt. Now the fun part begins, stretching the canvas. You lay the linen flat, its weave shimmering faintly in the low light. You can almost hear it whisper, anticipating what's to come. The first tack bites into the wood with a satisfying snap. You move clockwise, pulling gently, evenly so the tension stays uniform. Your knuckles ache. Your breath falls into rhythm. Pull, hold, tap, breathe. By the time you finish, the cloth is tight as a drumhead. You step back and tap it lightly with a fingertip. The sound sings through the frame, a low hum that feels alive. Painters sometimes joked that if you could tune a canvas like a lute, The painting would practically paint itself. A comforting myth, if not an especially useful one. A whisper of wind slips through the window and the stretched cloth shivers slightly. For a moment it almost seems to breathe. You wonder how many masterpieces began like this, just light fabric vibrating faintly in a draught. On a nearby wall, older frames hang waiting for repair. Some are twisted, their corners gaping like bad teeth. You can see where glue once held, where time pried the pieces apart. It's a reminder that even art's foundations crumble eventually. But then, maybe that's part of its charm, the quiet defiance of fragility. You turn back to your work, trimming the edges of the linen, folding them neatly behind the frame. The sound of the shears is hypnotic. You catch yourself humming an old street song without realizing it. Every studio has its rhythm, and this one's steady as a heartbeat. Occasionally the master leans over your shoulder to check your progress. Tighter, he murmurs. Always tighter. Canvas loosens when it remembers its cloth. You nod obediently. There's truth in that. Even the best stretching relaxes over time, the fibres remembering their former softness. The sun climbs higher, spilling over the benches. Dust glints in the light like tiny stars. The whole workshop feels suspended in its own small universe, one of glue pots, mallets, and the slow exhale of effort. You can hear the harbour bells through the open window, marking the hours, but they feel distant, irrelevant. You wipe sweat from your brow with the back of your hand. Stretching might look like dull work, but it's an intimate kind of craftsmanship, a conversation between hands and material. You press against the linen again, testing. Perfect. It's ready. Historians still puzzle over why some artists preferred looser canvases. Some say they liked the give beneath the brush, the way the fabric absorbed the movement. Others argue that tighter canvases allowed for finer detail. Maybe it came down to habit. Art, after all, is a series of preferences disguised as principles. You grab a handful of small wedges, offcuts from the carpenter's bench, and tuck them at the corners for reinforcement. Nothing fancy, just a little insurance against sagging. Then, for no real reason except satisfaction, you take a damp cloth and wipe the frame's edges. The wood darkens slightly, smelling faintly of pine and smoke. There's something quietly sacred about this step, though no one would admit it. It's the transition from raw material to potential masterpiece. The frame and cloth together form a threshold, a space where paint will soon turn ideas into presence. You imagine the finished piece, some mythological scene perhaps, or a portrait commission, the sitter's silk sleeves, the delicate play of light on hair. All of that will depend on what you're doing now, though no one will ever know it. A small joke drifts from the next room. One apprentice complains that his frame is cursed because the corners never meet. Another replies, "That's not a curse, that's your measuring." Laughter ripples through the studio, soft and brief. You grin to yourself and hammer the last tack in place. The room is quiet again. You lift the newly stretched frame and prop it against the wall. It stands there like an open window waiting for a view. The air feels suddenly cooler, as if the canvas itself has drawn in the light. You step back, wipe your hands, and breathe out slowly. The first stage is done, the frame and fabric now one. You feel a tiny ache in your fingers, the pleasant kind that tells you you've earned your sleep tonight. Somewhere beyond these walls, Venice carries on, boats creak, merchants shout, children chase pigeons, but in here, time holds its breath. Your canvas waits for the next transformation, when it will be sealed, primed, and finally ready to carry colour. For now it glows faintly in the sunlight, a blank promise stretched between wood and patience. You stand before the hearth again, the workshop quiet except for the soft burble of glue warming in its pot. The air is heavy with that sweet, unmistakable smell. Animal hide, damp wool, and something faintly like old parchment. It's the scent of creation before art, the scent of sighs. You swirl the mixture with a wooden stick, watching steam rise like tiny ghosts. Rabbit skin glue. The name alone feels strange on the tongue. You think of soft fur and quick eyes, not of the humble alchemy happening here. Yet this glue, made from the boiled-down collagen of animal skins, has been the secret guardian of paintings for centuries. It seals the thirsty linen, keeps the paint from sinking too deep, and gives the surface its first breath of resilience. You dip a finger into the pot and test the warmth. It should feel like a warm bath, never boiling. Too hot and the glue loses its strength. Too cold and it turns to jelly before it reaches the canvas. The master has taught you to judge by scent. When it smells faintly sweet rather than sharp, it's ready. You carry the pot to your work table, the amber liquid trembling inside. There's an almost ceremonial air to it, like pouring honey into the base of a fresco. You lay the canvas flat, and for a moment it looks like pale skin waiting for breath. Then you begin. The first brushstroke of glue leaves a translucent sheen across the fabric. It darkens slightly, tightening as it dries. You move quickly because the glue cools fast. The brush drags with a soft hiss, leaving faint ridges that catch the light. You can hear each stroke whisper through the silence. Shh. Historians still argue whether painters of the early Renaissance sized both sides of the canvas or only one. Some surviving fragments suggest that masters like Veronese sealed the back as well, to prevent moisture from sneaking in and rotting the fibres. Others believe that was unnecessary, or perhaps simply too expensive when glue was precious. You decide to follow your master's example and coat both, just in case. Better safe than sorry, as he always says. The glue soaks into the weave, stiffening it. The once flexible cloth becomes drum-tight again. You feel it harden beneath your fingertips, transforming from fabric into something more like parchment. This is where painting begins. Not with colour, but with this invisible barrier that no viewer ever sees. You pause, stretching your shoulders. The smell of glue fills the space, strangely comforting. The apprentices used to joke that you could tell a painter's age by how long they could stand the odour. The young ones gagged, the old ones called it perfume. You're somewhere in between. In a corner of the room, another pot of glue simmers over coals, just in case you need more. The cat sits beside it, tail wrapped around its paws, watching as if judging your technique. "You think you could do better?" you mutter, and the cat blinks slowly, unimpressed. A faint draught ripples through the window. You turn to see sunlight catching the glue's surface. It glows golden for a moment, then fades as it dries. There's something quietly magical about it. The way ordinary ingredients, bones, skin, water, patience, combine to make immortality possible. There's an old superstition in some workshops that if you talk too loudly while the glue cools, the air will ruin its bond. You're not sure if you believe it, but no one dares to test the theory. Silence hangs in the studio, thick as the scent. You think of the animals behind this craft, the rabbits, the deer, the fish. Every painting owes a small debt to them, whether the artists admit it or not. It's easy to forget how much of art is built on the bones of the world. You brush the final corner, then step back. The canvas glistens faintly, smooth as waxed paper. As it dries, it will tighten further, the fibres locking in place. You can almost hear them whispering to each other, promising to hold strong through centuries of varnish, pigment, and time. The master walks in, sniffing approvingly. "Good. Not too thick," he says, tapping the edge. "Too much glue, and the ground will crack. Too little, and the paint will drink the oil like wine." You nod, committing that balance to memory. Historians still debate the exact recipes. Some glue mixtures were spiked with honey or vinegar to prevent mould. Others added alum to harden the film. The ratios were never written down, only whispered from one apprentice to another. A teaspoon too much water, and your masterpiece could peel before its first exhibition. You pour what remains of the glue into a smaller jar for later. As it cools, it forms a trembling jelly. The apprentices sometimes carve their initials into the set glue for fun. It feels like working with edible amber. The master hates that. You do it anyway when he's not looking. As the canvas dries, you step outside to the courtyard for a moment of fresh air. The world smells gloriously alive. Olive oil, bread baking, the sea. You realise how strange it is that so much of this artistic ritual depends on what's already decaying. Animal, skins, old wood, and crushed minerals. Creation born from remnants. You come back in and test the surface. The glue has hardened beautifully, smooth and taut beneath your palm. When you drag your fingernail gently across, it gives a faint squeak. Perfect. It's ready for the next layer, the ground that will turn this stiff fabric into a luminous skin for colour. A memory rises unbidden. Your master once told a visitor, half proud and half jesting, that a good-sized layer could outlive a cathedral. "Stone crumbles," he said, "but glue remembers." You didn't understand then, but now, as you feel the firm resilience beneath your hand, you almost believe him. The cat stretches, yawns, and hops onto the bench beside you. You look down at your work and smile. The canvas gleams softly, no longer blank linen but something poised between craft and mystery. The glue pot cools, the light shifts, and for a moment everything feels still. You've crossed a threshold tonight. The raw has become prepared, the humble made sacred, and as the day fades beyond the window, you can almost imagine future colours breathing under your fingertips. You wake before dawn, when the light is still grey and the air holds that damp quiet that makes sound seem heavier. The canvas you sized last night now stands rigid, cool to the touch, and faintly glossy. It's ready for its next transformation. The ground, the underlayer, the thing that gives paint its first foothold. You place it flat on the work table. The glue has dried beautifully, smooth as shell, but it's far too absorbent to paint on yet. Oil paint would vanish into it like water into sand. What you need now is the gesso, the chalky bridge between fabric and colour. You reach for a small wooden box, open it, and breathe in the soft, dusty scent of powdered chalk. It smells faintly of stone and age, as if the earth itself is waiting to become light. The master says gesso is both skin and skeleton. Too thin, and the colours dull. Too thick, and the surface cracks like old parchment. There's a balance, as always. You take a scoop of chalk powder, ground whiting from the cliffs near Bologna, and sift it through a linen cloth into a bowl of warm glue water. A pale cloud rises, curling like breath. Slowly you stir. The sound is faint, like a spoon moving through cream. Historians still argue whether painters used gesso sottile, the fine, smooth kind made from slaked plaster, or gesso grosso, the coarse base for wooden panels, when working on canvas. Some claim Venetian artists adapted it, replacing gypsum with chalk to keep it flexible. Others suggest they invented entirely new recipes, oil-based primings that allowed their brushstrokes to slide like silk. You don't care who's right, you just know the texture must feel like melted porcelain beneath your brush. You carry the bowl to the canvas and begin brushing the gesso in long, even strokes. The mixture glides on milky white, soaking slightly into the cloth, filling every tiny gap between threads. The surface transforms before your eyes, from pale beige to luminous cream, as if moonlight had decided to settle there. It dries quickly in the morning air, tightening once more. You wait, then apply a second coat crosswise, careful not to overwork it. Each stroke whispers against the surface. There's a rhythm again. Shh. Pause. Shh. Pause. That lulls your mind into quiet focus. While it dries, you prepare another bowl for the coloured imprimatur, the tinted ground that painters often spread over the white gesso. Pure white, you've noticed, can be blinding, even hostile. It makes every colour scream too loud, too cold. A soft undertone, warm grey, pinkish umber, yellowish beige, gives the later paint something to breathe against. You mix a little red ochre into your leftover gesso, then thin it with linseed oil until it flows like melted wax. The colour is the shade of toasted bread, warm and familiar. The smell of oil fills the workshop, rich and nutty. There's an unspoken superstition among painters. Each chooses their favourite ground colour and swears by it as if it were religion. Titian, they say, preferred reddish undertones that made his flesh tones glow. Giorgione leaned toward olive grey, softening his shadows. Historians still debate whether these preferences were deliberate or simply byproduct of regional pigments, but each choice feels deeply personal, like handwriting. You spread the tinted layer gently, watching it dull the blinding white beneath. It's astonishing how quickly the mood changes. The surface now feels calmer, more forgiving. You imagine sunlight falling on it months from now, glancing across layers of glaze, the warmth of this ground glowing faintly beneath. In the corner, another apprentice sands an older panel, raising a fine chalk mist into the air. You sneeze. He laughs. Gesso dust for breakfast, he says. The meal of geniuses. You roll your eyes, though you secretly like the absurdity of it. Once your canvas dries, you begin sanding too. The gesso has hardened into a fragile crust, and you move a scrap of pumice stone across it in gentle circles. The sound is soft and soothing, like waves licking ashore. Slowly the texture smooths beneath your fingers until it feels like eggshell. You test it with a quick brush of your knuckle. It squeaks faintly. Perfect. The cat, ever curious, hops onto the bench and leaves a single paw print in the drying corner. You groan quietly, then laugh. Even that tiny mark will vanish under paint soon enough. Still, you make a mental note. The great works of art always begin with small disasters. As the day warms, the gesso's scent fades and the surface becomes almost luminous. You sit back for a moment, admiring the subtle matte sheen. It's strange how something so inert, chalk, glue, pigment, can hold such anticipation. You run your palm across it once more and it feels cool, solid, promising. The master passes behind you, peering at your work. "Not bad," he murmurs. "You've left it live." Never make it too perfect. Perfection kills paint, you nod. You're not sure you understand, but the phrase lodges in your mind like a seed. Historians still puzzle over what exactly he meant by that kind of life in the ground. Some think it referred to surface texture, the tiny pores that let paint grip. Others say it meant the vitality of tone, the warmth that breathes through layers. Whatever it was, you can feel it here, a living silence under your fingertips. By evening, the workshop glows gold with sunset. The canvases lean against the wall, all coated, all waiting. You look at them and see not blankness, but readiness, the calm before colour. You clean your brushes, scraping the dry gesso from the bristles into the waste bowl. It clumps like brittle snow. The air feels still again. Outside, bells begin to ring for vespers, their sound deep and slow. You imagine the painters of centuries past hearing the same tolls, pausing at this same moment, surrounded by drying grounds and cooling glue. It's comforting to think of that continuity, hands repeating the same gestures across time. You snuff the candle, stretch your back, and glance once more at your primed canvas. The soft tinted surface catches the last sliver of light and seems to glow from within. It looks, finally, like it's waiting for something. Maybe for colour, maybe for dream. Either way, you feel the calm certainty that the hard part of preparation is almost done. Soon, you'll draw the image, and the first ghost of art will appear. The studio feels gentler now. Yesterday's sharp scent of chalk and glue has mellowed into something earthy, like paper after rain. Your canvas, smooth and pale beneath its tinted ground, leans against the bench like a waiting stage. Today, you'll sketch the world onto it. Not in colour yet, but in ghostly charcoal lines. The calm before the storm of pigment. You pick up a stick of charcoal, black and brittle. It stains your fingertips with the soft grey of potential mistakes. Charcoal is forgiving. That's why you use it first. You draw lightly, so the lines whisper more than speak. At this point, a single wrong mark doesn't ruin anything. It just shifts the rhythm of the composition. The master says, you don't draw on the canvas. You draw into it, you're not sure what that means, but it sounds profound enough to remember. You let your hand wander, sketching the faint outline of a face. Before charcoal, painters used other tools. Metal point, for example, a stylus of silver or lead that left delicate grey trails on gesso. On wooden panels, it worked beautifully. On canvas, though, not so much. The surface was too flexible, too textured. Silver point dug in, snagged threads, and left marks that refused to fade. Historians still argue whether some early canvas painters adapted silver point anyway, perhaps out of stubbornness. There's evidence of faint metallic traces on certain Venetian works, but no one agrees how intentional they were. Maybe an experiment gone wrong, maybe a lost technique. You reach for a piece of red chalk, soft and warm. On the pale ground, it glows like the memory of blood. You use it to refine the hands, small ovals, tendons, fingers curving. The chalk catches slightly on the tooth of the primed surface, creating tiny flares of powder. You blow gently, watching the dust drift away like mist. In the corner, your fellow apprentice works differently. He's pricked a cartoon, a full-size drawing on paper with hundreds of pinholes, then laid it over his canvas. Using a small pouch of charcoal dust, he taps along the lines, transferring the design through the holes. When he lifts the sheet, a dotted image appears below, faint and perfect, like a constellation waiting to be connected. You try the same technique. The paper crinkles softly under your hand, the tapping rhythmic and oddly meditative. You lift the cartoon, and there it is, a dotted outline, the skeleton of the painting to come. You trace over it with thin charcoal, connecting stars into form. The studio is quiet except for the scratch of drawing. Outside, a bell tolls somewhere, the sound slipping through the shutters. You imagine painters in other cities, Florence, Antwerp, Paris, bent over their own canvases, tracing similar lines. The shared choreography of artists separated by miles but united by craft. You stop to study your composition. It's rough but clear, a figure, a few folds of fabric, the hint of landscape. The real challenge isn't what's here, but what isn't yet. The air, the movement, the pulse beneath the lines. Every artist faces this gap between idea and surface. Some cross it with grace, others stumble. You take a slow breath, steadying your hand. Historians still debate how much drawing the great masters did directly on canvas. Some claim they planned everything in detailed preparatory sketches. Others suggest they improvised freely once paint touched linen. The truth probably lies somewhere between genius and panic. You smudge a shadow gently with your thumb. The charcoal softens, spreading like smoke. The face begins to take shape. Not anyone you know, but familiar somehow, as if you've dreamed it before. Maybe you have. The cat strolls by and plops down on your palette, tail flicking dangerously close to the wet oil you're preparing for later. You sigh. You're a menace to art history, you whisper. The cat yawns, unbothered. A breeze stirs through the open window, scattering a few bits of charcoal dust. You watch them float, thinking about the fragility of all this. Every masterpiece begins as powder, groundstone, crushed plant, burned bone. Even these lines could vanish with a single careless brush of the hand. You lean back, stretching your arms. The light has shifted. It falls across your canvas at an angle now, highlighting every ridge of the ground, every faint line. You realise that soon these marks will disappear beneath colour. No one will ever see them again. Yet they'll remain, buried ghosts guiding the brushstrokes above. Sometimes, when restorers x-ray old paintings, they find these lost drawings, hidden figures, changed poses, even entire compositions beneath the surface. A secret history of indecision and evolution. You wonder if the masters ever thought about that. Whether they imagined future scholars peering through their mistakes. Probably not. They were too busy meeting deadlines. You make a few final adjustments, lift the chin slightly, tilt the eyes, refine the drapery's curve. Then you dust off your hands and blow across the surface once more. The faint grey particles scatter and settle. The image looks ready, not perfect, but breathing. In the fading light, you see the faint reflection of yourself in the varnished jars of oil. Your hair's a mess, your sleeves smudged with pigment dust, your mind half asleep. Yet there's peace in it, a quiet that feels older than the building itself. The master walks past, glancing briefly at your canvas. He nods. Good. Don't fall in love with it. Tomorrow the paint will bury it. You smile, because he's right. Every stage of painting demands surrender. The drawing, the underpainting, the glazes. Each must die a little for the next to live. You hang the finished sketching to rest overnight. The studio is dim now. Candles flickering. Charcoal dust glimmers faintly in the air, like tiny planets suspended in amber. You tidy your tools, chalks, brushes, knives, and wash your hands in a basin of cool water. Outside, the last light fades over the rooftops. The city exhales. So do you. Tomorrow colour begins. But for now, the canvas sleeps beneath its lattice of lines, holding the quiet promise of everything yet to come. Morning again, soft, silver, and carrying the faint chill of wet stone. You're awake before the rest of the apprentices, drawn by a quiet anticipation. The air smells of gesso dust and old oil, but beneath it lingers something sharper, more metallic. Today, you'll make colour. On the workbench sits a collection of small linen bags, each filled with something the earth once guarded. Ochre from Italian hillsides, azurite from Saxony, malachite, umber, vermilion, and that elusive dream of all painters, lapis lazuli. You untie one bag and pour its contents onto the slab of porphyry. The granules glisten in the dawn light like crushed seashells. Grinding pigment isn't romantic work. It's slow, gritty, and loud enough to wake the master if you're careless. You press the mueller, a smooth glass dome, into the pile of mineral and begin to grind in slow circular motions. The sound is steady, stone sighing against stone. Each pigment has its own temperament. Ochre behaves. It grinds easily, spreads like soft flour. Azurite sulks, it resists, clings to the muller, and stains your hands like bruised twilight. You push harder, feeling your arms ache, until the coarse sand turns to a fine powder. Historians still argue whether painters prepared their own pigments daily or bought them pre-ground from apothecaries. Some letters suggest great masters employed specialists called coloratori to handle the task, but others imply they couldn't resist the ritual themselves. There's a kind of intimacy in grinding colour, a dialogue between hand and element. You suspect the truth is that everyone did a bit of both. You move from mineral to mineral, and the bench becomes a landscape of colours. Warm ochre hills, cool green valleys, a river of crimson powder flowing dangerously close to your elbow. You pause to stretch your wrist, glancing out the small window. The sun has risen fully now, glinting off the water beyond the rooftops. The master once told you that grinding pigments was a form of devotion. Each colour has a soul, he said, and it resists being freed. You didn't understand at first, but now, watching the transformation of dull rock into radiant dust, you think you might. The next step is testing purity. You take a pinch of azurite and sprinkle it into a bowl of water. The real mineral sinks heavily. The impure, adulterated kind floats or clouds the liquid. You watch it settle. The good stuff, thankfully. You grin. It's satisfying to imagine this very blue one day haloing a saint or gleaming on silk sleeves. You pick up the small pouch labelled lapis lazuli. The powder inside is darker, heavier. True ultramarine, once worth more than gold, made from stones imported through Venice from the mountains of Afghanistan. The merchants guarded their sources like dragon hoards. There's a rumour that one shipment of lapis was paid for with a dowry. Historians still debate whether that's true or just another Venetian exaggeration. You spill a little of it onto the slab, carefully, reverently, and begin grinding again. The blue deepens with every motion until it looks like night trapped in dust. It's easy to see why painters called it the colour of heaven. Then there's vermilion, the red of fire and sin. Made from cinnabar, it's poisonous in careless hands. You've seen what happens when apprentices forget to wash. Their fingernails redden, their skin burns. Yet it's too beautiful to avoid. You crush it with respect, murmuring an old workshop joke. A little poison keeps the hand steady. You work through the morning, lost in rhythm. The colours grow finer, purer, more obedient. The light through the window shifts from gold to white. Occasionally you wipe sweat from your brow with the back of your arm, leaving faint trails of ochre and blue like war paint. The master enters around midday, glancing at your progress. "Good," he says, sniffing the air. "The stones are waking." He lifts a pinch of red ochre to his nose and smiles faintly. Earth and breath. That's what paint really is. You don't respond. You're too absorbed in the grind. The world narrows to powder and sound, to circles and patience. In the corner, another apprentice experiments with verdigris, the brilliant green made by suspending copper plates over vinegar and collecting the crystals that form. The smell is sharp enough to sting your eyes. He mutters, "It's beautiful now, but it'll darken by winter." He's right. Verdigris fades and browns with time, a treacherous pigment if left unsealed. Historians still debate whether painters knew how unstable it was. Maybe they didn't care. Beauty, after all, doesn't have to last forever. You finish your final batch and line the pigments in neat little mounds across the table. Each has a different texture, chalky, sandy, silky. You can tell by touch alone which will drink more oil, which will spread thin, which will cover greedily. The studio smells rich now. Earth, metal, vinegar, sweat, and a faint sweetness from the earlier glue work. The master hands you a damp cloth. Wipe the slab carefully. No colour should bleed into another you obey, watching the streaks merge into a muddy grey that pools like the memory of a rainbow. When you're done, he nods and says softly, "Tomorrow we make paint." Today you've only freed the stones. You lean against the workbench, exhausted but oddly content. Outside you hear the gulls again, circling over the canals. The blue of their wings reminds you of the azurite dust still clinging to your fingertips. You rub them together, feeling the faint grit. This colour, you think, could outlive empires. The sun dips lower, filling the room with honey-coloured light. The pigments gleam like jewels scattered on an altar. You can almost imagine each one whispering its own story. The mountain it came from, the miner who found it, the merchant who smuggled it, the painter who will one day make it sing. And for a fleeting moment, you feel the whole Renaissance breathing quietly around you, not in the palaces or cathedrals, but here, in this dust, in this slow miracle of turning rock into dream. The studio smells different today. Warmer, richer, like earth after rain mixed with something faintly nutty. The colours you ground yesterday wait in small shells along the table, patient as sleeping gems. Now they'll wake. Now you'll marry them to oil. You lift the flask of linseed oil first. It's golden, thick, and glows in the morning light like melted honey. When you pull the cork, a faint sharpness greets you. Dry grass, crushed seed, a hint of sunlight itself. The master swears that good oil should smell faintly of the field it came from, not of smoke or age. He's right. You tilt the bottle, watching a drop roll down the glass, catching the light like liquid amber. You pour a little onto the slab beside a mound of ochre and begin mulling again. This time the sound is softer, the stone sighing under the muller as the oil pulls pigment into itself. Slowly, the powder darkens, clumping, then smoothing into something alive. The transformation is slow but mesmerizing, from dust to silk, from earth to paint. You test it between your fingers. It spreads thin and smooth, leaving a stain the colour of sunrise on your skin. Perfect. The master joins you, holding up another flask. Walnut oil, he says, with mock ceremony. For those who fear yellowing. He pours a little into his own mixture of azurite. Walnut oil dries slower, smells softer, and stays pale longer. Venetian painters adored it for their blues and whites. Some even claimed it gave a more tender light. Historians still argue whether Titian used mostly linseed or walnut oil in his later works. Microscopic tests on his paintings show traces of both. Perhaps he chose based on mood, or price, or whim. Maybe art history is built on moments of indecision disguised as mastery. You watch him stir, the blue pigment melting into the oil like dusk spreading across the sky. The cat, uninvited as ever, slinks closer, sniffing curiously. One tail flick later, a small patch of ultramarine smears across its fur. You sigh. Congratulations, you tell it. You're divine now. The master chuckles softly, not looking up. Even the cat can't resist good colour. You continue mulling, switching to vermilion. The red gleams dangerously bright. You add a touch more oil, stir, and it thickens into a luscious cream. There's something almost edible about it, though you know better. Painters half-jokingly warn apprentices, taste your wine, not your paint. A good rule, if a little late for some. The process continues. Each pigment demands a slightly different treatment. Lead white drinks oil greedily, becoming buttery and opaque. Ochres behave politely. Cobalt blue, a later invention, would have been unknown here, but its predecessors, azurite, smalt, were trickier, needing just enough oil to stay luminous, not so much that they turn dull. You pause, wiping sweat from your brow. The studio's full of motion now, grinding, mixing, testing. It's like a small orchestra, each sound part of the same quiet rhythm. Brushes clink in jars, mortar stones rasp softly, and outside gulls cry above the canal. The master lifts a flask of resin. Venice turpentine, he says, pouring a few drops into the drying oils. A whisper of gloss and courage. The scent is sharp, piney, almost medicinal. It thins the paint, helps it dry faster, and gives the final surface a faint inner glow. Historians still debate whether painters added resins directly into their paint or saved them for final varnishes. Some recipes mention megielpem, a jelly-like mix of mastic and oil used to glaze. Others warn it ruins the paint over centuries. The truth, as always, lies hidden between brilliance and disaster. You make small piles of finished paints on a marble tile, little mounds of red, blue, yellow, white. You press your finger lightly into each one. They gleam, dense but alive, like tiny planets. There's a thrill in it. You've made matter that remembers light. When you set your muller down, your hands ache and your wrists feel coated in invisible grit. You flex your fingers, admiring the streaks of colour dried along your knuckles. The smell of oil, resin and pigment clings to your skin like a second identity. The master walks past, peering at your work. Good consistency, he murmurs. If it moves like breath, you've done it right. You nod. And if it doesn't? Then you've made soup, he says with a grin. You laugh, though you know he's not entirely joking. Badly mixed paint can sink, crack, or wrinkle after drying. The old painters learned to recognise trouble by feel alone. If it dragged, it was too dry. If it skated, too wet. Every touch carried knowledge that couldn't be written down. You scrape your leftover pigment into small seashells, each one holding a day's colour. Some workshops use bladders of pig skin tied with string, but seashells are honest. They don't pretend to last forever. Outside you hear the slow thump of oars on water, a gondolier calling faintly to another. The sound mingles with the heartbeat of the studio. You look down at your palette again. The paints glisten, almost breathing. You realise something quietly profound. All those glorious Renaissance paintings, those cathedrals of light and skin and silk, began like this. Not with inspiration or genius, but with someone hunched over a stone, grinding, mixing, waiting, the invisible labour beneath the visible miracle. You think of the strange chemistry in front of you, oil that hardens by absorbing air, pigment that captures light, resin that melts into glass, science and art, married by patience. As the afternoon fades, you clean your slab, wiping it carefully until only a faint shimmer of colour remains. Your wrists ache pleasantly, and the light through the window looks thicker now, as if the air itself has turned to varnish. You sit for a moment, hands resting in your lap, listening to the soft tick of cooling glass. Around you, the paints rest in their shells, quiet and full of promise. Tomorrow they'll touch the canvas for the first time. You smile faintly, imagining the first stroke, the small sound it will make, the way it will glide across the surface, the moment when dull linen becomes illusion. The day exhales. The master covers the paints with a damp cloth to keep them soft. The cat curls beside the shell of ultramarine, unrepentant and radiant. You dim the lamp and whisper to the colours, sleep well. Tomorrow you begin your centuries. You arrive at the studio early, before the others, because this is the part you secretly love most, the brushes. The faint click of bristles against glass jars, the gentle rattle of quills, the smell of old oil and damp wood. These are the painter's instruments, and though they look humble, they hold the precision of miracles. You take one from the rack. The handle is smooth, worn from years of use, the bristles stiff with yesterday's paint. A brush can live longer than an apprentice if it's cared for, though few ever are. You dip it into warm water, swirl it gently, and watch as faint streaks of colour leak into the bowl, yesterday's ghost returning for one last waltz. In Renaissance studios, brushes were not bought, they were made. You pick up a handful of hog bristles, coarse and pale. They came from the stiff hair on a pig's back, cleaned, sorted and tied into bunches. The bristles are strong, springy, perfect for pushing thick paint. You line them up by length, their tips uneven, organic, stubborn. Next, you take a hollow goose quill. Its base still smells faintly of the bird, an earthy musk that clings even after washing. You slide the bristles into the hollow shaft, binding them tight with linen thread. The motion is deliberate, almost ritualistic. The apprentices joke that the best brushes are bound with equal parts glue and prayer. You trim the tip with a small knife, turning the wild tuft into a controlled point. It's oddly satisfying, the way chaos becomes precision under your hand. When you test it against the palm of your hand, it bends just so, firm yet yielding. Historians still argue whether the finest Renaissance brushes came from Italy or Northern Europe. Venetian painters often favoured hog bristle for its strength, while Florentines swore by softer squirrel or marten hair for their delicate glazes. Each region had its temperament, its texture of light. The choice of brush changed not just technique, but the soul of the painting itself. You set the hog bristle aside and pick up something softer, a tuft of squirrel hair. It feels like silk, whisper light. Perfect for thin glazes, for shadows that breathe rather than sit. You tie it into a smaller quill, sealing the base with warm glue. The glue smells faintly of honey and ash, a scent that by now feels like home. You imagine what it must have been like before brushes, when fresco painters used bits of wool or feathers, or even fingers. In some ways, not much has changed. You still rely on touch more than sight to know when the bristles are right. The cat hops onto the bench, inspecting your work with regal disinterest. You wag a brush at it. You stay off the soft hairs, you warn. These cost more than you do. The cat blinks slowly, utterly unimpressed, and curls up beside the pile of quills anyway. You laugh under your breath and continue working. The next step is the ferrule, the metal or quill collar that holds the hairs in place. True metal ferules, made of copper or brass, are rare here. Most painters still rely on trimmed bird quills or thin tubes of reed. You slide the bundle in, secure it with thread, then dip the whole base into warm glue once more. When it dries, the bond will hold through hundreds of paintings, maybe thousands of strokes. You remember your master saying, "A brush doesn't wear out. It remembers." You didn't believe him at first, but he meant it literally. The bristles slowly shape themselves to their owner's hand, bending in sympathy with habit. Every artist leaves a fingerprint in the way their brushes fray. You test the new brush on a scrap of primed canvas. The bristles spread softly, leaving a delicate fan-shaped mark. Perfect for laying thin oil glazes. You smile. There's a strange pride in this, knowing you've made something that will outlive you in colour and form. Historians still debate how many brushes a painter like Titian or Veronese might have kept at once. Some surviving inventories list hundreds, others only a handful. It depended on temperament. Some artists cleaned obsessively. Others let brushes harden until they resembled sticks of stone. You suspect you'll end up somewhere in between. You gather the finished brushes into a neat bundle and hang them bristles down from a wooden rack. They sway gently in the air, like a row of sleeping moths. You feel a curious affection for them, these small extensions of your hand, your thought. The master enters, his own bundle of brushes clinking softly in a jar. He nods at your handiwork. "Good," he says, "but don't trust a new brush too soon. It needs to learn you first." He picks one up, dips it in oil, and flicks it gently across the canvas. The line it leaves is smooth, confident, alive. He smiles faintly. Now it knows. You stand beside him, watching the bristles leave their first faint trail. The air smells of oil, glue, and faintly of bird feathers. You can almost feel the centuries compressing into this small act, the quiet preparation that makes beauty possible. There's a story told in the workshop, half legend, half warning, about a painter who used his own hair to make a brush when the apprentices forgot to restock. The portrait he painted with it, they say, captured too much of his own likeness, as if the canvas remembered his spirit. Historians still debate whether that story's true, the older apprentices always add, but no one ever volunteers to test it. You finish cleaning the bench, lining up each brush by size. The cat, tired of being ignored, yawns and leaves, tail brushing your leg. The sunlight through the window hits the bristles, making them gleam faintly gold. You realise you've spent the entire morning crafting tools, not art, yet somehow the satisfaction feels the same. Each brush holds the promise of motion, of colour, of transformation. When the others return, you'll start mixing the day's palette. But for now, you stand still in the quiet workshop, surrounded by your new brushes, and listen to the faint creak of the wooden rack as they sway gently, like a small forest waiting for wind. The light slants across the studio floor in long, warm ribbons, dust motes floating lazily through it like tiny galaxies. You've been up since dawn, and your hands are already stained with the faint hues of yesterday's labours. Azurite under your nails, a whisper of ochre on your wrist. Today you'll do something both simple and sacred. Mix your palette. You open the shells and jars one by one, releasing a wave of smells that only painters know. Nutty linseed, sharp resin, faint vinegar from verdigris. The colours sit quietly at first, small, dense mounds waiting to breathe. You scoop a little white lead with your palette knife, thick and buttery, and spread it on a slab. Beside it, a dot of red, a smear of yellow, a droplet of blue that looks almost black until light hits it and reveals its secret fire. The master once said, "You can tell a painter's temperament by how they arrange their palette." You've never forgotten that. The meticulous types lay theirs like a clock face, each hue in perfect order, whites in the centre, shadows on the rim. The dreamers, like you, scatter colour like a weather pattern, trusting intuition to find what order won't. You begin to mix. Yellow ochre with white makes a sunlit cream. A breath of red added turns it to warm flesh. Add more white, and it becomes air. The knife moves in slow practice circles, scraping, folding, spreading. It's a quiet kind of music. Historians still debate how much preparation painters did before touching brush to canvas. Some say they worked from strict palette formulas passed through guilds. Others think it was all improvisation, a daily chemistry of sight and mood. Letters from old masters mention the morning's colours as though they were living things, temperamental companions. You believe that. Some days your pigments behave like angels, Others, they sulk and separate. You line up your colours now: lead white, yellow ochre, red ochre, vermilion, green earth, azurite, lamp black. The basics. You'll blend what you need as you go. You thin a few with oil until they gleam like wet glass. They look alive now, and a strange calm fills the room. On the canvas before you, the underdrawing waits, faint lines whispering beneath the pale surface. You stare at them, then back at the palette. This is where hesitation lives, where the painter stands between possibility and regret. One wrong mix and hours of grinding, boiling, brushing will turn to mud. You breathe deeply, roll your shoulders, and start. The first strokes are cautious. You lay in shadows, thin washes of umber and black, just enough to give weight. The brush feels supple, obedient. The sound of it gliding over the gesso is faint but steady, like cloth being folded. You smile despite yourself. It's always this way, the first dance steps with colour. The master passes behind you and murmurs, "Begin with air, not flesh." You nod, though you don't quite understand. He means start light. Let the tones rise slowly, but his phrasing makes it sound like poetry. As the morning grows, the palette becomes a battlefield of half-mixed hues. You use the back of your knife to carve through puddles of colour, scraping old blends into new ones. The smell of oil grows heavy, sweet, faintly dizzying. The cat, always drawn to danger, prowls near the palette and sniffs at the ultramarine before deciding it's unworthy of further inspection. A small joke drifts through your memory. An apprentice once sneezed on Titian's palette and created a better blue than he ever mixed on purpose. Whether true or not, you can almost believe it. Historians still argue whether Titian's Venetian glow came from layering transparent pigments or from sheer, happy accidents. Maybe both. You wipe your brush on a rag, study your work. The tones are coming together, muted but warm. You've built a storm of browns and reds that feel like undercurrents beneath skin. You add a breath of white and suddenly light appears, not just reflected but growing from within. You sit back, a little surprised. It never stops feeling miraculous when colour behaves. By midday, your palette looks chaotic, streaks of pinks, greens, dull greys born from careless mixtures. But you've learned not to waste them. The master says the best painters steal from their own mistakes. You scoop a grey smear with your knife and discover it makes a perfect neutral glaze. Historians still debate how much mixing happened on the palette versus directly on the canvas. Some say painters of this age preferred to blend wet layers right on the surface, letting brush and time do the chemistry. Others argue they pre-mixed every tone in daylight before painting began. Watching the play of light on your own colours, you suspect both approaches had their charm. You pause, leaning close to the palette, and notice how each paint surface reflects light differently. The lead white glows like porcelain. The vermilion absorbs light and releases it slowly as though breathing. These are small things, but they matter. The Renaissance painters understood that colour isn't only about hue, it's about how light moves through matter. As the day fades, you scrape your palette clean. The leftover streaks mix into a soft grey-brown, the colour of dusk. You use it to tone a small study. Nothing important, just a quick sketch of a hand. The brush glides easily, the paint spreading thin and smooth. When you step back, you realise you've lost an hour without noticing. That's the trick of this work. It steals time quietly, replaces it with calm. The cat purrs nearby, dreaming of nothing. The master hums a hymn off key while cleaning his own brushes. You smile, wipe your knife, and set your palette down. The studio smells of warmth, pigment, and patience. You think of how tomorrow you'll begin layering colour in earnest. Glazes, scumbles, whispers of light. But tonight, it's enough to have learned once again that colour is alive, and that your hands can coax it, however briefly, into harmony. The studio is warm again, air dense with the mingled scents of oil, varnish, and faint smoke from the master's pipe. The morning light through the tall windows slices into golden rectangles, touching everything. The brushes drying on their rack, the palette still damp with yesterday's colours, and the silent canvas that's been waiting all week for this moment. Today, you finally begin painting in earnest. You dip a brush into the thinned umber mixture and breathe slowly. The first touch is always hesitant. Your hand hovers a fraction too long before the bristles meet the surface. Then it happens. Paint slides across gesso with a low whisper, dark and translucent, finding the faint charcoal lines beneath. This is the underpainting, the imprimatura, the invisible skeleton of every masterpiece. It's not supposed to impress anyone. It's supposed to anchor what comes next. You block in the shadows first, thin and smoky. The colour is earthy, almost the same tone as the studio walls. It dries quickly in the morning air, leaving a faint matte sheen. As you work, your mind quiets. Each stroke becomes automatic, less about decision, more about rhythm. The surface breathes. You follow. Painters call this dead colour, not because it lacks beauty, but because it's where the life hasn't arrived yet. You're building bones and tendons for the colour that will soon pulse on top. The master calls it painting in whispers. Historians still debate whether painters like Titian or Bellini worked directly into wet paint or built layer after layer of dry glazes. Evidence suggests both. You suspect it depended on weather, on patience, on how fast the patron's messenger was knocking at the door. As you move, the brush changes voices. The hog bristle lays down broad strokes, rough and fearless. The softer squirrel hair blends edges like breath. You shift brushes without thinking, letting instinct choose. The underpainting begins to suggest depth. A shoulder here, a fold of cloth there. Nothing precise yet, just atmosphere. The master stops behind you and murmurs, "Don't chase perfection. The ghost must breathe." First, you nod. He always sounds like he's quoting scripture, though you suspect he just enjoys hearing himself sound wise. By midday, your painting has turned into a map of values. Brown, grey, and faint gold where the ground peeks through. It looks almost sculptural, a bas-relief of tone. You wash your brush, shake out your cramped wrist, and step back. The figure on the canvas seems to emerge from fog, half seen, half born. Now comes the true alchemy, glazing. You mix a transparent film of pigment and oil, thin enough that the underpainting still shines through. The first glaze, warm red over brown, transforms shadow into skin. It's like watching candlelight seep into flesh. You work slowly, waiting for the brush to drag just slightly before reloading. Too much oil and it floats, too little and it drags. The trick is a kind of intuition that no master can teach. It's learned by error, by the quiet panic of ruining a face with one careless stroke. There's an old saying among painters, "You don't paint light, you let light escape." You see that now. With each translucent layer, the figure gains volume, warmth, life. The gesso beneath catches and reflects light through the glaze, like sunlight through skin. You laugh softly to yourself, remembering an absurd bit of gossip from another workshop. That one painter, obsessed with luminosity, mixed crushed pearls into his glazes. Historians still debate whether he was eccentric or just rich, your master once said, smirking. Probably both. The smell of oil and resin thickens as the day wears on. The sound of bristles across the surface becomes hypnotic, steady. You lose track of time. By the time you glance out the window, the light has turned amber. Now you begin to scumble. Thin, opaque paint dragged lightly over dried glazes to soften transitions. You use the side of the brush, barely touching the surface, letting the texture of the canvas break through. The effect is subtle, like mist or breath. Highlights bloom almost accidentally, a halo here, a shimmer there. You realise that scumbling is more about restraint than control. You stop before it looks right, because overdoing it kills the illusion. The best painters, you've learned, stop one gesture before they're satisfied. The master watches in silence, then finally nods. "Enough," he says softly. "You've reached the silence between colours." You don't entirely know what that means, but you feel it. The painting's rhythm has slowed. It's light, steady. You clean your brushes carefully, squeezing each bristle between your fingers. The rinse water turns the colour of weak tea, the residue of hours of work. Historians still argue whether glazes and scumbles were meant to last forever, or simply long enough for fame to set. Many Renaissance paintings darkened over centuries as oils yellowed and varnishes clouded. Some even changed mood entirely. Bright dawns turned to twilight. You think about that often. Perhaps art's beauty was never meant to stay constant. Perhaps its decay is part of the performance. As you hang the canvas to dry, the smell of paint lingers in the air, sweet, earthy, alive. You step back, and for a moment the figure seems to breathe, caught between matter and spirit. The master looks over and gives the smallest smile. "Tomorrow," he says, "we add life to the eyes." You nod, tired but content. The studio fades into quiet. The brushes lie rinsed, the palette scraped clean. You lean against the window frame, watching the last light dissolve over the city. Somewhere, a bell tolls the hour, slow and heavy. You think of the layers beneath your painting. The chalk, the glue, the earth pigments, the oils, each one waiting centuries to speak in colour. You whisper a small goodnight to the canvas, to the room, to the dust that glows in the fading sun. And in that stillness, the past feels impossibly close, breathing with you in rhythm, slow and endless. The next morning, the air in the workshop feels heavier, like it's been steeped overnight in oil and quiet ambition. You arrive before sunrise again, habit now, and stand before the painting you left to dry. The glazes have settled overnight into a soft sheen, the colours deepening as if they've been breathing in their sleep. The face is half-formed, the light tentative. Today you'll give it eyes, that smallest and most terrifying of tasks. Painters always joke that it's when the canvas starts looking back at you. The master says it's when the divine gets impatient and tries to climb out of the paint. You just hope your hand doesn't tremble. You mix a small pool of lead white with touches of umber and black, thinning it with a drop of walnut oil until it gleams like pearl. The palette knife hums faintly against the marble slab. When you hold the mixture up to the light, it shifts temperature depending on where you stand. Warm in sunlight, cold in shadow. Perfect for a human gaze. You take a fine brush, one of the squirrel hair ones you made earlier, and test it against your fingertip. Soft, precise, unthreatening. The studio is so quiet you can hear the paint whisper against the bristles as you load them. The first dot of white on the canvas, tiny in the corner of the iris, brings the illusion to life. It's a trick of optics, of course, but it never fails to feel like magic. One moment, pigment. The next, consciousness. You sit back, studying it, then lean in again. You darken the pupil with a mixture of umber and ultramarine, deepen the shadow beneath the upper lid. The eye softens, turns moist. It feels almost indecent to watch it happen. Historians still argue about whether painters in this period used optical devices, simple lenses, curved mirrors, to refine such lifelike effects. Some say it's nonsense, that mastery needs no machinery. Others whisper that even Vermeer had a secret mirror in his corner. You smile, imagining the arguments that would have erupted over dinner tables centuries later. The truth probably lies somewhere between genius and gadget. By mid-morning, the painting stares back at you with quiet confidence. You dab your brush into a faint glaze of crimson and run it along the lower eyelid. Barely there, just enough warmth to make the eye seem alive. The master pauses beside you, silent for a long while. Then he says, "Now it's breathing. Don't ruin it," you grin. He means stop before overworking it. Every apprentice learns the same hard truth. Perfection is one brushstroke past ruin. You move on to the drapery, letting the folds gather light like silk under candle glow. For these you use scumbles again, thin, opaque layers dragged over dry colour. The fabric begins to shimmer faintly, each highlight built from restraint, not boldness. The trick is to make the viewer believe the light changes as they move. There's an old story, half legend, that Giorgione once painted drapery so convincing a tailor tried to measure it. Historians still debate if it happened, the master once said, but it's too good a lie not to keep. You remember it now, smiling as your brush flutters over the folds. You mix a glaze of ultramarine for the background, thinning it with turpentine until it flows like smoke. The smell fills the room, sweet, resinous, faintly dangerous. The blue deepens, darker toward the edges, softer near the light of the face. The figure begins to separate from the void around it, alive in the glow of your own invention. The cat wanders by, tail flicking lazily, and you swear it squints at the painting as if judging your composition. "Don't start," you murmur. "You were the one who sat on the pallet yesterday." The cat ignores you, naturally. By noon, you've entered that peculiar trance painters talk about, the place between attention and sleep. Your body keeps moving, but thought fades. You mix, you stroke, you wipe, you breathe. When you finally step back, the figure on the canvas looks calmer than you feel. You realise the room has darkened without you noticing. The light outside has shifted to that golden suspended hour before evening. It feels like time itself has been holding its breath while you worked. You clean your brushes carefully, one by one. You rinse them in turpentine, wipe them on a rag, then dip them lightly in oil to keep the hairs supple. The smell is sharp, soothing, and familiar. You think again of all the painters before you, hundreds, maybe thousands, ending their days with the same ritual, the same sigh of fatigue and quiet pride. Historians still debate what Renaissance studios smelled like. Some imagine perfume and civility, others a riot of smoke, sweat, and turpentine. You know it's both, heaven and work sharing the same air. The master steps closer, gazes at your canvas, and says only, "It's begun." You know he means more than today's progress. There's something in his tone, a mix of approval and melancholy, that makes you think of how fleeting even this craft is. Paint cracks, varnish yellows. But for a few decades, or centuries if luck holds, it breathes. You place the brush down, the bristles clicking softly against the glass rim of the jar. The sound feels final. The painting glows faintly in the dying light, the eye you painted reflecting a single pinprick of the setting sun. For a moment, the entire room seems to exhale, the canvas, the wood, even the air. You feel both proud and absurdly small, like a shadow of the painters who came before. Outside, someone calls across the canal. The sound echoes faintly, softening with distance. The master starts humming again, a low, tuneless rhythm. You let the sound fill the silence. Tomorrow you'll start the varnish tests, sealing the surface, preparing it for its slow transformation into something the world might one day treasure, or forget. But tonight, it's enough that the eye on the canvas sees you back. You smile faintly, whisper goodnight to your own creation, and snuff the candle. The faint scent of linseed and pine follows you out of the studio, as if refusing to let the day end. By morning, the scent of drying oil still lingers, a faint sweetness woven with something metallic, the smell of time in slow motion. The canvas you finished yesterday leans in the corner, half-shadowed, its gaze turned toward the window as though it too is waiting for the light. You pause for a moment, studying the surface, the sheen of glazes catching dawn like dew, the muted hum of colour deepening as the paint cures. It feels alive in its stillness. Today isn't about painting, it's about patience, about letting what you've done harden into something that will last. And then, finally, about protecting it. You begin by checking the surface with the back of your hand. The touch is dry but faintly tacky. Just enough to leave a whisper of warmth. Perfect. Not too soon, not too late. You bring out the jars of varnish, small, amber-tinted, viscous, and set them beside a brush that looks almost translucent with age. The master enters quietly, a mug of bitter wine in one hand, squinting at your work. "The paint's sleeping," he says, "but it dreams of gloss." You chuckle softly, recognizing his usual morning poetry. The varnish, made from mastic resin dissolved in turpentine, is clear as honey and smells like pine forests under sun. You stir it gently, watching bubbles rise like captive stars. Some painters prefer dammer, others amber or copal, each with its own peculiar shine. Historians still debate which recipes were safest, which yellowed least, which might one day darken entire skies in old canvases. Truth is, they all betray you eventually. You pick your poison and pray for patience. You take your brush, dip it halfway, and lift it slowly. The varnish threads like molten glass. When it finally drops, it lands with a soft plop into the jar again. That's how you know it's right. Thick enough to coat, thin enough to spread. The first stroke across the painting feels perilous. The clear liquid dulls everything for a heartbeat, turning the surface cloudy. Then, slowly, the gloss returns, colours deepen, shadows find their voices, highlights bloom. It's like watching the painting remember itself. The smell fills the studio, heady, resinous, unmistakably alive. You move methodically from top to bottom, always in one direction, overlapping slightly so the film stays even. Too thick and the varnish will wrinkle. Too thin and it won't protect. The line between mastery and ruin is as ever, only a few brush hairs wide. The master leans against the wall, arms folded, watching without comment. Finally he says, "Good, It breathes now, you nod, stepping back. The varnish catches the light like morning dew on a leaf. It glistens for a while before settling into an even, silky glow. Historians still argue whether painters varnished their works immediately or months later. Some waited for the paint to cure completely, fearing that trapped oil vapours would cloud the finish. Others couldn't bear the weight. Letters from the time suggest both approaches and plenty of disasters. You think patience was always the rarer art. As the varnish dries, you turn to the question of storage. Finished paintings, the master always says, are like cats. Too much attention and they misbehave. You build a small frame to cradle the canvas while it rests, leaning it at an angle so dust won't settle. The smell of fresh-cut wood joins the varnish in the air, a mingling of life and decay. You sweep the floor, gathering bits of pigment dust, stray hairs, and hardened drops of oil. The studio looks calmer now, less like chaos, more like aftermath. You catch yourself smiling. The cat wanders in, sniffing the air curiously, then curls beside the varnish jar. You watch it for a while, thinking how many centuries of painters had cats exactly like this. Companions indifferent to genius but loyal to warmth. In the far corner, another apprentice rolls a finished painting for transport. The canvas crackles faintly as it bends, the sound like dry parchment. Rolling is dangerous, creases can ruin months of work. But when you've got to ship art across damp Venetian canals, risk is part of the job. He hums nervously as he ties it with soft twine. Historians still debate how long these varnish paintings lasted before needing repair. Some say decades, others centuries. You suspect it depended more on the weather and the whim of fate than chemistry. You wander to the window. The city outside glimmers in reflected light. Rooftops, water, the cries of gulls. You realise that everything around you is coated in its own kind of varnish. Salt on stone, soot on brick, memory on air. The thought makes you strangely peaceful. The master comes beside you, silent for a moment. "You've learned the hard parts," he says quietly. "Now you must learn to stop." He means more than varnishing, you think. He means to let things be, to trust that the painting no longer needs your hand. You nod, and he smiles faintly, as though you've passed some invisible test. By evening, the varnish has dried to a soft glow. The painting looks both older and newer, its surface unified, its depths mysterious. You lift it gently, angle it toward the last light, and for a moment it seems to hum with quiet satisfaction. You whisper something you didn't plan to say. "You'll outlive me." The cat stretches, unimpressed, and the master laughs softly from across the room. "If you're lucky," he says. You set the painting down, cover it with a clean cloth and tidy the bench. The brushes dry on their rack, the jars are sealed, the slab is clean. For the first time in days, the studio smells not of work but of rest. Outside, the bells begin to toll again, slow and low. You lean on the sill, watching the reflections ripple across the canal, and feel a small, strange gratitude. For the glue, the gesso, the dust, the oils, the patience. For the silence that follows creation. Evening comes with a softness you've earned. The varnish is set, the brushes are clean, and the workshop smells of resin, oil, and faint smoke from the hearth. It's quiet except for the cat's rhythmic purr and the slow creak of wood contracting in the cooling air. You've finished. Not just the painting, but the cycle itself. You pull a stool to the window, watching twilight pour itself through the city. The sky fades from gold to violet to a blue so deep it might be ground lapis come alive. Down in the alley, a cart rattles past, the driver humming a tune that feels older than the stones. Inside, the master packs his pipes, muttering a prayer that's half habit, half gratitude. He doesn't speak for a long while, then he says softly, "Now you know what silence costs." You do. It's the sound left behind when work is done, the hush that falls between centuries of brushstrokes. You glance at your painting standing upright on the bench. Under the evening glow, it looks less like a creation and more like a companion, something that will stay behind when you've long gone. The light in its varnish flickers faintly, like a secret candle. You think of all that's gone into it. Glue made from the memory of animals, chalk crushed from ancient seas, pigments born of mountains, oils pressed from seeds that once caught the sun. You've taken the bones of the world and taught them to glow. There's no more alchemy than that. Historians still debate the details of these humble miracles, how hot the glue should be, which oil yellows least, whether the masters truly mixed wine into their varnish for luck. None of it matters now. The truth lives in the silence of this room, in the scent of drying paint and the way light still chooses to land softly on your work. The cat stirs, stretches, and climbs into your lap. You scratch behind its ears absently, eyes drifting shut. Your muscles ache pleasantly, the day's effort humming faintly through you. You imagine this moment stretched across centuries, one painter after another, closing shop as the world outside darkens. The master clears his throat. Tomorrow, a new canvas, he says, already turning away. You nod, knowing full well that tomorrow always begins again. More glue to heat, more gesso to grind, more patience to relearn. That's the quiet truth of the craft. Art is less revelation than repetition, and peace hides somewhere in that loop. You take one last look around. The empty stretchers stacked in the corner, the jars of pigment capped and sleeping, the faint glimmer of gold dust in the air where the last sunlight meets the varnish haze. Everything hums with stillness. You whisper to the painting, barely audible, "Behave while I'm gone." The cat flicks its tail in agreement, or protest, it's hard to tell, and you laugh softly. The night deepens outside. You let your eyelids grow heavy, thoughts dissolving into the rhythm of your own breathing. You picture the workshop centuries from now, dust settling where you stand, the same air thick with quiet work, someone else stretching canvas, stirring glue, wondering if their hands are steady enough. You hope they will be. You hope they'll smile at the faint scent of rabbit skin size and think, someone loved this before me. And now the story softens. The brushes rest, the pigments sleep, the oils settle into still glass. You too can let your pulse slow. The workshop's air is warm and heavy, the faintest breath of pine and turpentine drifting like incense. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bell tolls once, and then nothing but the sound of your breathing remains. You picture the canvas drying, its colours deepening like dusk, the varnish catching a single point of light and holding it. Every detail you've imagined tonight, the soft drag of a brush, the creak of wood, the hush of grinding stone, lingers as a gentle rhythm, a lullaby built from patience. Even the arguments of historians fade now. No debates about pigments or binders matter here. Only stillness, only the slow exhale of centuries. You imagine your own thoughts settling like dust over finished paintings, the edges softening, the noise dimming. Somewhere in that silence, the same peace the old painters felt seeps through, the sense that nothing more needs doing, that the world can wait until morning. Your body sinks a little deeper, your breath evens out. The night grows thicker, darker, kinder, and as sleep begins to gather round you like varnish sealing colour, you remember the quiet truth whispered across time. Even art sleeps, sweet dreams,